Hi, Yotam. Uh, this is Grandma again impersonating Grandpa. So I will now continue. I think the last sentence I read was they all had the same strange reversed eyes with white pupils instead of black ones, bland gray irises instead of colored ones, and blackness where the white should have been, which Haroun had first seen on the face of Mudra. But unlike the Shadow Warrior, these Chupwallas were scrawny, sniveling, weaselly-looking types wearing black hooded cloaks adorned with the special insignia of Cult Master Katam Shud's personal gods. That is, the sign of the zipped lips. They look like a gang of office clerks in fancy dress, Haroun thought. But they're not to be underestimated. They are dangerous, no question about it at all. The Chupwallas clustered around Buck the Hoopoe and stared curiously at Haroun, which was annoying. They were riding what looked like large, dark seahorses, which seemed to be just as puzzled by the Earth Boy's presence as their riders. For information only, Buck the Hoopoe revealed, these dark horses are machines also, but a dark horse, as is well known, is unreliable and not to be trusted. Haroun wasn't listening. He had just seen that the wall of night, which he had thought to be the beginning of perpetual darkness, was no such thing. It was, in fact, a colossal ship, a vast ark-like vessel standing at anchor in the clearing. That's where they'll be taking us, he understood with a sinking heart. It must be the flagship of the cult master Katam Shud. But when he opened his mouth to say as much to If, he found that fear had dried his throat, and all that came out of his mouth was a strange croaking noise. "Ark," he croaked, pointing to the dark ship. "Ark, ark." Gangways with railings slanted down along the side of the dark ship. The Chupwallas brought them to the foot of one such gangway, and here Haroun and If had to leave Buck the Hoopoe behind and begin the long climb to the deck. As Haroun climbed, he heard a piteous cry and turned to see the Hoopoe protesting without moving its beak. But that you must not take. No, you can't. It's my brain." Two cloaked Chupwallas were on Buck's back, unscrewing the top of the Hoopoe's head. From the head cavity they removed a small, dully gleaming metal box, emitting, as they did so, a series of short, satisfied hisses. And then they simply left Buck the Hoopoe floating there, its circuits disconnected, its memory cells and command module removed. It looked like a broken toy. "Oh, Hoopoe," Haroun thought, "I'm sorry I ever teased you about being only a machine. You're the best and bravest machine that ever there was, and I'll get your brain back for you. Just see if I don't." But he knew it was an empty promise, because after all, he had troubles of his own. They climbed on. Then If, who was behind Haroun, stumbled badly, seemed on the verge of falling, and grabbed Haroun's hand, apparently to steady himself. Haroun felt the water genie pushing something small and hard into his palm. He closed his fist over it. A little emergency something, courtesy of P2C2E House. If whispered, "Maybe you'll get a chance to use it." The Chupwallas were ahead of them, and behind as well. "What is it?" Haroun muttered in his lowest voice. "Bite the end off," If whispered, "and it gives you 2 full minutes of bright, bright light. So it's called a bite-a-light, for obvious reasons. Hide it under your tongue." "What about you?" Haroun whispered back. "Have you got one as well?" But If did not reply, and Haroun understood that the water genie had given Haroun the only such device he possessed. "I can't take it. It's not fair," Haroun whispered. But now one of the Chupwallas hissed at him so terrifyingly that he decided he'd better keep quiet for a while. Up they climbed, wondering what the cult master had in mind. They climbed past a row of portholes. Portholes are the holes in ships, that you see out into the air or the water through. And Haroun let out an astonished gasp, because pouring out of the portholes came darkness. Darkness glowing in the twilight the way light does from a window in the evening. The Chapwalas had invented artificial darkness, just as other people had artificial light. Inside the dark ship, Haroun guessed, there must be light bulbs, except they'd have to be called dark bulbs, producing that strange darkness so that the reversed eyes of the Chapwalas, which would be blinded by brightness, could see properly, although he, Haroun, would be unable to see anything at all. Darkness you can switch on and off, Haroun marveled. What a notion! I swear! Then they reached the deck. Now Haroun realized just how enormous the ship was. In that dim light, it seemed that the deck was literally infinite. Certainly Haroun could not see clearly all the way to the bow, or indeed to the stern. It must be a mile long, he exclaimed, and if it was a mile long, then it was probably at least half a mile wide. Outsized, super-colossal big, If morosely agreed. Arranged in a sort of checkerboard pattern on the deck were great numbers of gigantic black tanks or cauldrons. Cauldrons is a huge pot in which things are cooked, usually made out of iron. Each with its own team of maintenance operatives. Pipes and ducts led into and out of each of these, and there were ladders up their sides. Small mechanical cranes were positioned by each cauldron, too, with buckets hanging from maliciously sharp-looking hooks. Those must be the poison tanks, Haroun guessed, and he was right. The cauldrons were brimful of the black poisons that were murdering the ocean of stories. Poisons in their most potent, pure, undiluted form. It's a factory ship, Haroun thought with a shudder, and what it makes is far, far worse than the sadness factories back home. The largest object on the deck of the dark ship was another crane. This one towered above the deck like a tall building, and from its mighty arm, Haroun saw immense chains descending into the waters. Whatever hung at the end of these chains down below the ocean surface must indeed be of astonishing size and weight, but Haroun had no idea of what it was. What struck Haroun first about the dark ship and everything upon it was a quality of what he could only call shadowiness. In spite of the mammoth scale of the ship itself and the terrifying size and number of the poison tanks and the giant crane, Haroun kept having the notion that the whole affair was somehow impermanent, that there was something not quite fixed or certain about it at all, as if some great sorcerer had somehow managed to build the whole thing out of shadows, to give shadows a solidity that Haroun had no idea they could possess. But this is all too fanciful for words, he told himself. A boat made out of shadows, a shadow ship? Don't be nuts. But the idea kept nagging at him and wouldn't let go. Look at the edges of everything here, said a voice in his head. The edges of the poison tanks, the crane, the ship itself. Don't they look, well, fuzzy? That's what shadows are like. Even when they're sharp, they're never as sharp-edged as real, substantial things. As for the Chapwalas, all of whom belonged to the Union of the Zipped Lips and were the cultmaster's most devoted servants, well, Haroun kept being struck by how ordinary they were and how monotonous was the work they had been given. There were hundreds of them in their zipped lips, cloaks, and hoods, attending to the tanks and cranes on the desk, performing a series of mindless, routine jobs, checking dials, tightening joints, switching the tanks, stirring mechanisms, on and off, swabbing the decks. That means cleaning the decks, washing them. It was all as boring as could be, and yet, as Haroun kept having to remind himself, what these scurrying, cloaked, weaselly, scrawny, sniveling clerical types were actually up to was nothing less than the destruction of the ocean of streams of stories itself. How weird, Haroun said to If, that the worst things of all can look so normal and, well, dull. Whoops. Normal, he calls this if side. The boy is crazy. Bananas, out to lunch. Their captors pushed them toward a large hatchway in which were set two tall black doors bearing the zipped-lip symbol of Yotam. All this was done in total silence except for the eerie hissing sound that the Chupwallas used instead of speech, and when they were a few feet from the double doors, they were stopped and held by the arms. The double doors opened. This is it, Haroon told himself. Through the doors came a skinny, scrawny, measly, weaselly, sniveling clerical type exactly like all the others, but also unlike, because as soon as he appeared, every Chupwalla in sight began to bow and scrape as energetically as possible, for this unimpressive creature was none other than the notorious and terrifying cult master of Bezabon, Yotam, the big bogeyman himself. That's him, Haroon thought with a kind of disappointment. This little minging fellow? What an anticlimax! Now came another surprise. The cult master began to speak. Khartoum should neither hissed like his minions, nor croaked and gurgled like Mudra the Shadow Warrior, but spoke clearly in a dull, inflectionless voice, a voice nobody would ever have remembered if it hadn't belonged to so powerful and terrifying a personage. Spies, said Yotam dully. What a tiresome melodrama. A water genie from Gup City and something more unusual. A young fellow from, if I'm not mistaken, down there. So much for all your silence nonsense, said If with considerable courage. Isn't it typical? Couldn't you have guessed it? Wouldn't you have known the Grand Panjandrome himself does exactly what he wants to forbid everyone else to do? His followers sew up their lips, and he talks and talks. Khartoum pretended to ignore these remarks, although If had said them out loud. Haroon stared at him, looking particularly at the edges of the cult master's body, and finally he was sure it was there, that same fuzziness, that wobbliness that he had spotted in the dark ship itself. Shadowiness, he had called it. And he'd been right. No doubt about it, he decided. This is the cult master's shadow, which he learned how to detach. He has sent the shadow here, and he remains in the citadel of Chup, where the Guppy forces, along with Haroon's father Rashid, must be heading even now. If he was right, and this really was the shadow become human rather than the man grown shadowy, then Yotam sorcery was very powerful indeed, for the figure of the cult master was entirely three-dimensional, with eyes moving visibly in its head. I never in my life saw such a shadow, Haroon had to admit, but his conviction that it was indeed the cult master's shadow self that had come to the old zone in this dark ship continued to grow. The Chupwalla, who had removed Buck the Hoopoo's brain box, stepped forward and gave it to Yotam with a bow of the head. The cult master commenced tossing the little metal cube lightly into the air, murmuring, Now we shall see about their processes. Too complicated to explain. Once this is taken apart, I'll explain these processes. Never fear. Just then, Haroon had a notion that made his head spin. Yotam reminded him of someone. I know him, he thought, in utter amazement. I've met him somewhere before. It's impossible, but there it is. He's very, very familiar. The cult master came over and peered into Haroon's face. What brought you up here, eh? He said in his dull, dull voice. Stories, I suppose. He said the word stories as if it were the rudest, most contemptible word in the language. Well, look where stories have landed you now. You follow me? What starts with stories ends with spying, and that's a serious charge, boy. No charge more serious. You'd have done better to keep your feet on the ground, but you had your head in the air. You'd have done better to stick to facts, but you were stuffed with stories. You'd have done better to have stayed home, but up you came. Stories make trouble. An ocean of stories is an ocean of trouble. Answer me this. What's the use of stories that aren't even true? I know you, Haroun shouted. You're him. You're Mr. Sengupta, and you stole my mother, and you left the fat lady behind, and you're a sniveling, driveling, mingy, stingy, measly, weaselly clerk. Where are you hiding her? Maybe she's a prisoner on the ship. Come on, hand her over. If the water genie held Haroun kindly by the shoulders, he was shaking with anger and other emotions, and If waited until he had calmed down. Haroun, lad, it's not the same guy, If gently said. Maybe he looks the same, the spitting image, the exact double, but believe me, boy, this is the cult master of Bezaban. Khatum should, in his clerkly way, seemed quite unperturbed, that means undisturbed. His right hand continued absently to toss, but the hoopoe's brain box into the air. Finally he spoke in that droning, sleepy-making voice of his. Stories have warped the boy's brain. Now he daydreams and spouts rubbish. Insulting, abusive child. Why would I have the slightest interest in your mother? Stories have made you incapable of seeing who stands before you. Stories have made you believe that a personage such as Cult Master Khatam Shud ought to look like this. Haroun and If both cried out in shock as Khatam Shud changed his shape. The cult master grew and grew before their appalled, astonished eyes until he was 101 feet tall, with 101 heads, each of which had 3 eyes and a protruding tongue of flame, and 101 arms, 100 of which were holding enormous black swords, while the 101st tossed but the hoopoe's brain box casually into the air. And then, with a little sigh, Khatam Shud shrank back into his earlier clerkish form. Showing off, he shrugged. Stories go in for such displays, but they are unnecessary and inefficient too. Spies, spies, he mused. Well, you must see what you came to see, though obviously you will not be able to make your report. He turned and began to slink back toward the black doors. Bring them, he commanded, and was gone. Chuckwaller's soldiers surrounded Haroun and If and pushed them through the doors. They found themselves at the head of a wide black flight of stairs, which disappeared down and away into the pitch blackness of the interior of the ship. This is Chapter 10, Haroun's Wish. As Haroun and If stood there at the top of the stairs, the absolute darkness created by thousands of dark bulbs suddenly disappeared, to be replaced by the dim twilight. Khatam Shud had ordered the big switch off so that he could taunt his captives by showing them the extent of his power. Haroun and If could see their way now, and they began to walk down into the belly of that immense ship. All around them, Chuckwallers were putting on really rather fashionable wraparound dark glasses to help them see better in the increased light level. Now they looked like office clerks pretending to be rock stars, thought Haroun. And that is the end of this section.